but they're doing it based on last year's budget. Ralph could tell you more exactly, but there was about at least a $5 billion structural debt. It's going up to 8.5. 5.9, 6, we'll call it 6 billion in round numbers. It's going up, if we did nothing, it would go up to at least $8.5 billion. Structural debt, he's already explained to you. It's very simple. You probably have experienced it in your own checkbook. It's when you don't have enough money to pay your bills. That's the state of the state. But we're still paying out money. Some of that's good. For instance, we're paying out money to state employees. We're paying out the money, since these were decided in court, we're paying out the money to keep the court system going. So certain bills that we're paying, the good part is we're paying the cost of the pension this year because it's a court decision. But there are a few things we're not paying, and some of them you might be noticing. For instance, we're no longer paying health care bills. We're saying we might pay health care bills for retirees and current employees someday. And so far, the hospitals haven't said exactly they won't take you in the emergency room or give you surgery or let you see your doctor. But in fact, the state has stopped all payments through Cigna and all of the others for everybody's health care. Just a promise someday maybe the state will pay health care costs. We're not paying the MAP grants. So our students here at UIC, who many of whom depend on state funding, it's not very much, it's $2,500 a semester, but it's enough to make the difference of whether they can attend school or not. It's not only happening at public universities, it's happening at all universities across the state. The one that's most obvious is we're not paying social service agencies. I had a speaker from the Coalition of the Homeless yesterday. They do a survey of all of the homeless organizations that provide services. 32% of all the agencies that provide service to the homeless have either closed or closed programs. And we could go on listing the social services that are being cut. The one the newspapers have picked up most often are the services for the disabled, the home care services for senior citizens and so forth. And that is getting drastically worse by the minute. That is not under court order, and so the state simply pays notice for practical purposes, and make it just general. We don't pay for any social services in the state. We might again pay for social services in the state, but we're not doing that, and it's beginning to have real effects. Now, why is this impasse in place? I mean, most years in the state of Illinois, we're used to an impasse. They get to the end of this legislative session, they can't agree on the budget, they have a little crisis, and a month later they settle everything and we go back to doing business as usual. That isn't happening this time. The governor is demanding changes to the way we do business, or the rules of Illinois. And that's and there are basically three kinds of things the governor's demanding. One of them is term limits and redistricting, which I happen to think is a good idea. I wouldn't mind to have term limits. I think that having a fair redistricting would be better than what we have. Nonetheless, for obvious reason, the Democrats don't think that's such a good idea because they're in charge of both branches of the legislature, and if you change either term limits or redistricting, the chances are they wouldn't have the kind of control that they do. Second thing that Ralph already mentioned is, to put it in simple terms, the governor would like to destroy labor unions, or he'd like to destroy a lot of the conditions which allow labor unions to function well. I won't go into the details, but the governor thinks labor unions are somehow a bane on the state. If we were more like Wisconsin or somewhere else, businesses would come running into the state, we would be flooded with new economic growth, and life would be eaten here in Illinois. The governor's wrong about all of that, but I don't want to get into a long debate about it. We can if you want, but the main point is the governor has not only the questions of undermining the Democratic Party with the issues of term limits and redistricting, but he wants to destroy a social base or a contract that we call labor unions, or the rules about labor unions. And the third, the governor wants some very specific reforms on things like unemployment insurance. And actually, the Democrats and the governor could probably come to some agreement on unemployment insurance. There are some stupid things about the way we do unemployment insurance. And it wouldn't take geniuses to work out a compromise on unemployment insurance, but it's still a sticking point, because depending on how you do unemployment insurance reform, you could produce very different results, which might be good or bad for different groups. Now, there are also, the fourth point, so you could call this the governor's agenda, you know, for change or political change in Illinois to permanently change the landscape to be more business or Republican friendly. The second thing is there's a difference in the actual proposed budgets. I'll just use the university budget as an example. The governor wants to cut our budget by the state's share of our budget by 31.8%. The good news for all of us is the Democrats' proposal is to cut us only 8%. And while 8% is a lot, and IBHE and other places say we shouldn't be cutting anything, we ought to be improving higher education, and we might all agree with that. All things considered, I'd rather have an 8% cut than a 31% or 32% cut in our budget, in our state budget. That difference shows up across a lot of line items in the budget. I just use this one because if you care about it, it's an easy way to demonstrate the difference. Nonetheless, rational people getting together in the room could conceivably figure out which things to cut and which things not to cut, and almost anybody else could sit down and work this out. It's the kind of thing we usually work out between the Democrats and the Republicans in state budgets. But it is an impediment. You know, even if we didn't have the governor's demands about everything, unions and everything else, we would still have budget differences to solve. And last of all, one of the problems is that both budgets proposed by the Democrats and the ones proposed by the Republicans have this $5 billion structural debt that we aren't proposing the right taxes to fill, and maybe up to $8.5 billion, depending on how bad we let things get out of balance. So we're going to even if neither the Democratic budget nor the governor's budget actually works, even if we, you know, could get them to agree on one budget or the other, neither are functional. And so they really have to make some more cuts. So the bottom line is I can predict what will happen. That's fairly simple. What should have happened 4 months ago, the Democrats and the Republican leadership will get in the room, they will decide these things, and they will produce a budget. I can't tell you when that will happen. I can tell you it's worse every day that it doesn't happen. I can also tell you that the governor is not going to get all of the changes that he wants. So the question is, can we give the governor, the Democratic side of the legislature and all, can they give the governor enough of what he wants to come to an agreement without destroying labor unions, without destroying the Democratic Party and so forth? For instance, we could easily agree to, say, some unemployment reforms, unemployment insurance reforms, and term limits that are going to take effect in 8 years or 12 years when none of the current legislators would be likely to be impacted. So something like that kind of trading could conceivably happen. What can we do about all of this? Well, the thing I think we can do most is to point out the harm that's being caused to the state to the extent that we can get people demanding that this get resolved. The information as it dribbles out in the news media and the rest is too piecemeal to get everybody really upset. They get upset, they say, okay, oh, that's too bad they're taking away this from disabled children, or it's too bad this part of the budget isn't working right, but you know, we don't know what we can do about it. What we can do about it is have a concerted demand that the leaders sit down, create a budget, and make Illinois functional again.
So, now it's your turn to ask questions of our panelists, and I think this is a traveling mic. I'm going to ask someone to walk around with it. While you're thinking of your questions, I want to add something. At 8 o'clock this morning, I was at a meeting in downtown Chicago on Chicago and Illinois biotechnology, and everybody wants to get more business to Illinois, to Chicago. And there's interaction with the university because new ideas come from the university, discovery, and these are moved forward into startup companies. Everybody's enthusiastic. And the first thing that came up are, what are the obstacles? Number one, Illinois budget, Illinois government. The businesses are scared because they don't know what's going to happen. Actually, if they knew the tax would be this, or the cuts would be that, they'd say, now we can sit down and decide whether we're going to come here or not. So that was the number one thing. You don't notice something like that within a month or two, but it's very, very serious into the future of our city and our state. Question?
Yes, I have two naive questions.
There are no naive questions. Don't ask us.
Yes. First of all, if the state legislature writes a budget, I don't know who to address this to, and given the power that's invested in the state legislature, why don't they pass the necessary bills to fund the budget?
They have. The governor vetoed. So the answer is a budget for FY 2016 covering everything passed the General Assembly on a purely Democratic vote through the House and the Senate. And then the governor vetoed most of it. What he left in place was the K-12 and early childhood budgets. And so those are technically funded. We do have an education budget for the year. And I think there's two reasons the governor did that. I mean, one of them is he has made it clear that education is one of his priorities, and so I don't think he wanted to do something to harm schools. But second, you know, Brenda, you made the point, and Dick, you made the point, people aren't screaming about the problems. Well, they're not screaming about the problems because the school's opened on time. And for most people, that's their interaction with state government. So what's really been cut are services primarily focused on vulnerable populations. So it's not just those with developmental disabilities, although those have been cut significantly. It's mental health, and it's child care for single working parents. It's domestic violence prevention and treatment. So I think one of the truisms of fiscal policy, if you really want to look at the basics of tax policy, is that if your state happens to be fiscally bankrupt, it pretty much encourages morally bankrupt decisions by politicians to focus budget cuts first on the most vulnerable populations. And the reason for that is simple. Not everyone, in fact, most of their constituents don't have a direct experience with these specific social services being cut, whereas everybody went to school. So they will cut these services because while some people might yell and scream over here or over there, all their constituents won't be up in arms about it. So it's a really pernicious thing. But we did get a budget passed through the General Assembly. And just to echo what Dick was saying, the budget passed by the Democrats spends $1.8 billion more on services than does the governor's proposed budget. That said, the budget passed by the Democrats cuts spending on services this year by over $500 million from last year's budget. And in both budgets, the Democrats and the governors, the deficit will grow from $5.9 billion to over $9 billion, which would be over 40% of spending on current services.
So the governor's veto can't be overridden?
Well, no, it could if you had the vote. And I got to throw in my best line in my talk, which is the best line was what Mayor Daley used to say to us: "You ain't got the votes, kid." We don't have the votes to override the governor's veto, and we can't get the votes because they're Republican votes. You could get a Republican here or there. So the idea of just overriding the veto isn't viable politically.
My second naive question concerns
LaSalle Street tax, what guarantee that the LaSalle Street tax won't suffer the same fate as the Illinois State Lottery?
Yes, go ahead.
That's actually a good question, in that we are working with a couple of sponsors of the bill to make sure, A, it isn't just used to pay off ongoing deficits, and B, it is channeled into the 4 areas that Ralph and CTBA always highlight as the places where we need significant spending. Yes, that's part of the legislation we're working on.
Do we need a constitutional amendment?
No, this is the reason. There's this interesting point here. Some years ago, some of us started working on this, and we thought the city of Chicago, city council, could pass the tax. We then discovered that back in the early 1980s, the then CEO of the Board of Trade, a man named Tom Donovan, went down to Springfield and said, I want you to preempt the ability of the city of Chicago to levy such a tax. And the legislature did so. But it can be passed now at the state level. Or alternatively, the legislature could undo that preemption and say, Chicago, it's over to you, you decide. But it does not require constitutional amendment.
So what Bill's talking about is the general constitution has home rule powers to the city, but those are only the powers that the state has not, to use his word, preempted. So the state can always take them away. In most areas, we can tax anything that doesn't move fast, but where they're preempted, we can't. And the other, everybody says, well, why don't we just have a graduated income tax, which makes perfect sense, only unfortunately it would take a state constitutional amendment. And it's very difficult to get a state constitution, particularly on something like, can we raise the taxes on you if you make more money? That's a very difficult constitutional amendment to pass.
Hello, gentlemen. I have a question. Where is the plan or law to make sure that lawmakers do not borrow against our pensions in the future after they have the pension has become sold?
Yeah, well, good luck with that. So, the first time the state of Illinois appointed a pension commission to look into the serious underfunding of the pensions that was being done by the legislature and the governor to fund services was 1916. So this isn't a novel practice in the state of Illinois. Now, I go back to what drives the practice, though. The practice is driven by that structural imbalance between revenue growth and service cost growth. So there's been a significant political incentive to avoid dealing with tax policy and find this irresponsible borrowing that somebody down the road has to deal with paying back, but the politicians doing the borrowing don't. They've tapped that lever about as hard as they can. And now it's really not available anymore, and they still have their structural imbalance and have to repay the debt. So I don't think going forward it will be as much of an issue if, in fact, there are adequate and sustainable recurring revenues coming in to fund current services. Because right now, the structural deficit is being contributed to by this growth in the repayment obligation for the pension systems, and no legislators want to deal with that anymore. They tried their unconstitutional approaches, right, to cut benefits, et cetera, alone among all the people commenting on it from the outside. The Center for Tax and Budget Accountability said, this is unconstitutional on its face. It's not a gray area. I mean, we had all these other good go, well, it's gray, we don't know what the courts will do. Yes, we do. I could read the English language. English language is pretty clear here. There's no need to interpret. And so now that it's been laid to rest on any level that they could go after benefits, I think once they have a pathway to solvency that's rational and based on recurring revenues, the strong incentive to continue this irresponsible fiscal practice will go away, and they won't go to it again until some future fiscal crisis comes up down the road, and then they'll try to find a way out.
Is someone at the back? Oh, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Somewhere down the line, the same thing could happen.
Yeah, see, the problem is, legislation can always be changed. Voters want to hear these guarantees, and I guess I'm not a snake oil salesman. So unless you're willing to get a constitutional amendment that's very specific on the issue, you cannot get ironclad protection. You just can't. Legislation can always be changed. That said, if you eliminate what was really the incentive that drove the bad decision will tend to not be made, at least if Illinois acts like most other states. So most other states have not as significantly underfunded their pensions, and in fact, they only resorted to underfunding their pensions intentionally during times of recession, et cetera, where they felt a revenue crunch, and so they skipped a payment or two here or there. Illinois has done it habitually, and that's really one of the primary differences here. And our habitual engagement in borrowing against the pensions is what's created the huge unfunded liability we have. And so if you take away the incentive for that habitual borrowing, it will not happen.
There's a question at the back of the room.
Okay.
I'm going to try to, we'll come back to you later. I think there's some others on the table, but we'll return to you if we can.
Could they raise their hand?
I've got a pretty big voice. It's a good segue, Ralph. I very much appreciate what you've been doing in terms of reframing the pension discussions around the state and the media. It's been very helpful to me. Question: is it getting any traction in Springfield? These ideas, whoever the future Senator Blisses and Ekritzes are. Is it getting any traction? Is there going to be, are these ideas going to filter into the next round of pension discussion?
Yeah, we're very hopeful that in fact they are. We were, like I said during my short presentation there, we've been specifically tasked with drafting legislation, and we have done that would implement a refinancing, a reamortization of the repayment schedule to the pension systems, and we've done that. We've done it on a level dollar amount. It is now going under peer review by the actuaries at TRS to make sure they would read and interpret the legislative language the way we want them to. Because if the actuaries would read it differently than we intended, we will change the language to make the actuaries happy, right? And I will also tell you that there is strong legislative support, not publicly yet, but behind the scenes for this approach. And in fact, at the very highest level and in leadership. And we've approached the governor's administration about it and talked with them about the dollars and cents of it and the rationale for doing it, and the response was relatively positive, but it certainly wasn't negative in any way. And I think anyone in Springfield who's a decision maker who really takes the numbers seriously, and frankly there are a number of decision makers who do, recognize this reamortization has to be part of the final deal. And that even goes up to people like the Senate President, who's at his heart a wonk and can do math and is very interested in it. He still has his own ideas about this consideration-based change, and he wants that to be part of things. But all that said, all that stuff aside, even folks before that weren't really seriously considering this reamortization are asking for briefings and are getting up to speed, and the legislation is drafted. So it's got a chance. I think for it to have a bigger chance, your members have to do some lobbying to their home legislators, right? And meet them in district and say, look, you don't solve your... We could change tax policy the way we recommend in here. And once again, there's a lot of political support for these recommendations. Generate that additional $8 billion in revenue annually and still not get rid of the structural deficit if we leave this current pension ramp in place. So it really has to be part of the solution.
Early on, I read a criticism of the reamortization plan. I think it would, who knows where it was coming from, but the thought
Illinois
was,
Policy Institute. No, go ahead.
the thought was that the reamortization plan required extending out the time horizon
It does.
by which the books would balance. And part two of the criticism was that the bond rating agencies would have conniption fit over that. And I'm just wondering, can you
Okay,
respond?
to the second part, the bond rating agencies won't have any problem. And they won't have any problem with it because the repayment schedule that we've designed gets the systems to 72% funded in 30 years. And you're considered healthy at 80%. And it gets the systems to 72% funded while, like I said during my presentation, meeting all cash flow obligations of all 5 systems to pay benefits to current and future retirees. So it works. The argument on, gee, but it takes longer than 30 years to get it done is frankly specious based on the facts. And the reason for that is pretty simple. This debt, which is now $111 billion accumulated debt, can't be paid in 30 years. There's no rational payment plan that gets it 100%, 90%, or even 80% funded in 30 years. Can't do it. unless you're willing to cut spending on education, health, social services, and public safety by 46 to 49%. Because it's the same tax dollars that fund current services that fund your repayment of your pension obligation. So actuaries want the whole thing taken care of in 30 years, and that would be the best practice. Sometimes the best practice isn't doable. This is one of those situations where you really can't pay this $111 billion debt off in 30 years. And by the way, it was incurred over about a 70 or 80 year period. So let's be a little bit rational and take a common sense approach. So it's not a kicking of the can down the road, which is how it gets described, because it works, right? The kicking of the can down the road is the old pension ramp, the one we're living under, which for the first 15 years intentionally grew the unfunded liability from $17 billion in 1995 by law to $48 billion in 2008. That was the law. So, you know, that's a kick of the can down the road, that's silliness. This is like, no, let's pay the obligation, but in a rational and affordable way. We still need more revenue to do that, by the way. So it's really different. The final argument I've heard, so I'm going to deal with all these arguments, is that, well, you're hurting our children because you're making them pay past 30 years for this. And I go, really? I'm freeing up tens of billions of dollars for current services on education, social services, and healthcare that benefit children. Or the kids could pay for this debt in 30 years and have lousier schools, no access to the social system, right? So this doesn't borrow against the kids in the future. It doesn't harm the children. It's not one of these kick the can down the road things. It's a common sense, rational approach that works and gets the pension systems paid off and on a path to 100% funded in the most rational and fastest way possible while still accommodating the need to make investments in current services.
Let's just say two things real quickly. One is the idea, by the way, that extending a loan is very common in finance. Illinois would not be unique. There's a saying in finance, a rolling loan gathers no loss. And that's that plot that should be out there here. Secondly, I really like what Ralph just did, we should all learn to do it. He took an argument that's made by those who oppose to do this, about how it's going to cost our children, burden our children, turned it on its head and made it clear that that argument was actually dead wrong. The actual reverse was true. And I spent a lot of time on the South Street tax with these legislators, dealing with people. It's easy for people to follow sort of conventional wisdom. You have to think, wait a minute, we got it backwards. We have to sort of have those things at the tip of our tongue when we go and lobby for these things.
Every time I hear you talk, Ralph, it sounds as you keep saying rational.
You are a great American.
But, Dick Simpson, there seems to be no political will, or is it that the General Assembly is irrational for the most part? Where is the political will to get this sort of rational, thoughtful, comprehensive kind of strategy implemented?
Well, that's the big question, and it's particularly, I think, well, it's a question on both sides. What can make Madigan, Fullerton, and the Democrats do what they need to do, but I think the trickier one is what can make Governor Ronner do what needs to be done. With the Democrats, it's pretty easy. It's to be able to threaten that their party candidates won't get reelected in the 2016 election. Governor Ronner seems to care about that on the Republican side. Any other public official would. And so our best bet with Ronner is to suggest that every Republican candidate running in the 2016 election, including the candidate for president, will lose because it's Ronner's fault that the things are so bad. I'm not arguing this ideologically. I'm arguing, how would you have to approach it? I don't know whether that will work with Ronner because he's so ideological or has such strong views about what we have to do if we're to be a business-friendly place.